Welcome. My name is Fernalise Henry. I am a secondary social studies specialist at the School District of Palm Beach County. And welcome to the first virtual African American Institute. I hope that everyone is well and that you ended up your school year on a positive note if you are in the field of education. And if not, I just hope that you're just doing well in general. Okay, so today I am going to talk about African Americans, Latinos, and social activism. One of the reasons that I pick this topic, other than it being the common thread for our institute, is that I am a Latina myself. I am a Black Latina. And one of the things that um, I find hard as I research in history is to find examples of how Latinos and African Americans have worked together in order to further their cause here, specifically in the United States. Now, I understand and know that during the Civil Rights Movement, that we do have the Chicano movement, right, and we have the Civil Rights Movement, which is considered to be a Black movement or just for African Americans. But the reality is after World War II, people from many different groups, especially Latinos and African Americans, viewed freedom on an international level. So, as a history teacher, one of the things that I wanted to do is establish a historical perspective between Latinos and between African Americans. I also wanted to highlight the certain revolutionary leaders and highlight, of course, the Republic of Haiti and what impact it had not only on Latinos, but what impact Haiti had on the United States. And then fast forward to the period right after World War II, 1945, going through to the 80s, and looking at specific examples of how African Americans and Latinos worked together under the banner of a common cause, under the banner of solidarity, understanding and realizing that they are fighting for some of the same things. All right, so we're going to go ahead and begin. And I am going to start off with a quote from the African American newspaper, the Chicago Defender, from 1915. And so here is the quote. They have Indian blood in their veins, so have we. They have African blood in their veins, so have we. They have European blood in their veins, so have we. It is only a difference in degree. So I chose this quote because I wanted to show the similarities that we have with Latinos, and also to understand, if you look at the history of the transatlantic slave trade, that there is a huge Black population in Latin America. And we will see as we go along how in Latin America it wouldn't have been possible for those who were in the upper classes. I'm not talking the ones who are at the very, very top, the peninsulares, but those who are anything below that upper ruling class, they would have never been able to win the revolution without the support of African people, without the support of the indigenous people. Okay. So, the first thing we're going to talk about is the plantation system in Latin America. They have a small class of large landowners and enjoy extensive powers on their estates. They have haciendas, and in Brazil, they would be called fazendas. And initially, we know that they exploited the Native American people to clear the land, to form these colonies and to turn a profit. And by that I mean the Spanish, and then we have the Portuguese in a little bit of a different situation, but they brought over a majority of the slaves to this new world. So what we see is very similar to what we'd see in the United States with the plantation system that existed, because we have these high profit cash crops like sugar, for example, that could make the colonizers tons of money and give them obviously not only economic power but control. But it is definitely at the expense of, at first, the indigenous peoples, and then later the African peoples. I also want to add that besides the plantation agriculture, there were ranches and mining. If we look at the mines at Potosi, Africans worked horrendous conditions after we had many, many indigenous people die in those conditions in Potosi. So it's important for us to see, unfortunately, the way that these that it was set up back then is that there were many plantations throughout Latin America, and also, here in the United States. Okay, the next thing that I wanted to talk about is the social hierarchy that we have in Latin America and the social structure of the Spanish colonies. But before we do that, I actually want to read a quote. All right. The quote says, "I believe our society has fell into a pyramid system where there's people relegated to the bottom of the pyramid, and there's people that feel like they are entitled to the top of the pyramid." Now, obviously, on the screen, you see a pyramid, but this is a quote by Ice Cube in 2016 that I came across and that I found, and I thought it was interesting as I was sitting here doing my research that I found that quote as I was talking about the social structure, or looking at the social structure of the Spanish colonies. So, keeping that quote in mind, when we look at the social structure of the Spanish colonies, they organized, by they, I mean the crown organized the divisions within the Spanish society in order to benefit them. So when, for example, we first have the Spanish encountering the indigenous peoples or the Native Americans, they had a policy where they had two different republics. República de los Indios, Republican of the Indians or the indigenous people, República de los Españoles, and so we have the Spanish people, and it's almost like they initially just created two very distinct cultures right away. And we know that they exploited the Native Americans after many were decimated by disease. And so this split that they made is, to me, a clear indication that they did not obviously see them as being equals. Now, they obviously had to work together in the sense that they needed to have the indigenous peoples there to help them clear the land, and so on and so forth, and to use them, in essentially slave labor. But it reminds me of also when we go back to our history in 1619 in Jamestown, when we have the first slaves coming over, and they are definitely, separate from everybody else. Now, as time along in the United States, we have different laws that it essentially stripped away the rights of Africans. As time went along, and institutions were put in place to keep them separated. So, this whole idea of segregation or separation is definitely something that the social structure of the Spanish colony exemplifies, and is reminiscent of how we separated Blacks and whites in the United States. So, if we look at the very top of the social pyramid, we see that the peninsulares are the people who have the most power. And that's where we also have the fewest people. So, if we're looking at all of Latin America, to be fair, to include Brazil as well. So, if you were born in Spain, or if you were born in Brazil, anywhere on that Iberian Peninsula, you were considered to be a peninsular. And even though you might have never set foot in Latin America, the royal government, or the king or queen, would put you in charge. Most of the time, it was a king. They would put you in charge, and you'd hold the highest levels of positions in Latin America. Just below that, you have the Creoles or Criollos. Okay. So these Creoles were Americans of European descent, and they were considered to be a middle class. So that means that both of their parents were from Spain or both of their parents are from Portugal. So they were just below it. And if you see in that yellow portion of the social pyramid or social structure, they make up the quote unquote the middle class. And as we go below, again, the further down you go, the less power, the least amount of power that you have, and the more people that exist toward the bottom of that pyramid. Then we have mestizos. So mestizos are mixed blood, and they have European and Native American or indigenous or Indian ancestry. And then you also have mulattoes who are mixed European and African ancestry. And then at the very bottom, we have African slaves and Native Americans. So if both of your parents are slaves, if both of your parents are Native Americans, you are at the very bottom of this social structure. Now, you do have stories of a handful of stories of those who were able to move up a little bit in the social classes, but let's make it clear it was those who had a little bit of, mixture, um, of European mixture within their blood that usually were able to do that. So, this social structure of the Spanish colonies really set up a system where the people at the bottom, the poorest people, the ones who suffered the most, the ones who really did not have any rights, they would be the ones who would later on help out the Creoles, the mestizos and mulattoes as well. So it is the people that are coming from the bottom with the least amount of power that are trying to always move forward and to gain right for themselves. Okay. So here we have a map of Latin America in 1800, and the two places that I'm going to focus on when we look is Saint Domingue, which later would become Haiti, and I drew an arrow to that. And then we're also going to look at Dolores, which is just north of Mexico City in Mexico. Right. So the first thing I want to talk about is called the Grito de Dolores. And on the top right hand, you'll see just a very powerful depiction of Miguel Hidalgo Costilla. And if you take a look in the background, I know it's kind of hard to see, but you see a man that is holding a torch, and you see people who are holding torches. And I think the most important thing to take away from that, and if you look at that man, you could see that if he's not full African, he's definitely has African ancestry within him. So the Grito de Dolores, the cry from Dolores, or of Dolores, was the battle cry of the Mexican War of Independence, which was in 1810. And Miguel Hidalgo, worked with indigenous people. He worked with the very poor people as a priest, and he was appalled by the conditions that the people lived in. And he believed that he had the power and that the people had the right to rise up against the Spanish government. And this is part of what he says, or what he said in 1810. He said, "My children, a new dispensation comes to us today. Will you free yourselves? Will you recover the land stolen 300 years ago from your forefathers by the hated, Spaniards? We must act at once." So he is calling upon the poor people to form their own rebellion, to form their own revolution, to claim the land that he believes is rightfully for those who were poor. He definitely did not believe that the people had to live in such horrible poverty, especially when there was so much land to be given, especially when they could rule themselves and hopefully just live a better life. That's all they wanted, is to live a better life. So he actually led an army of 80,000 Indian and mestizo revolutionaries against the Spanish military and the Creoles who feared losing their wealth. So even going back to 1810, we see that they're the people who are toward the bottom of the social structure, the social ladder, the social pyramid in Latin America are the ones who are saying, we want to have more. We want to have our land. We want to have our freedom. And the Creoles, who were again just below the Peninsulares, they were afraid at how many people gathered together. And unfortunately, Miguel Hidalgo was executed, but that did not stop the revolutionary cause. It wasn't going away. And one of the things that I want you to keep in mind, if you don't already know this, is that the Mexican people have a very strong tradition of social activism, right? When we talk about social activism, it is the intentional action with the goal of bringing about social change. And these are the people who later on, as we intertwine with the United States and our history moves forward, this is the tradition that the Mexican people come from and are going to bring forward through these social activist movements. So they come from a very, very strong tradition of social activism. And here we have a painting of Jose Maria Morelos. So Jose Maria Morelos took over Father Hidalgo's position in the revolutionary cause and the cause against the Spanish crown. And what's interesting is that he, in 1815, was speaking to a group of people and he described the social hierarchy in Latin America as the de jure caste system of oppression. So when we talk about de jure uh, case system, de jure means like the legalized, okay, the legalization of oppression in this case. And here in the United States, we have de jure and we have de facto segregation. So I selected those words because I wanted to show that even back then, the Latinos, in this case, Jose Maria Morelos, was thinking about how oppressive the system was, especially toward the indigenous people. Okay. Now we are going to look at the Haitian Revolution, right? So if we look at Saint Domingue was a very interesting situation. Okay. So a lot of people, and I should say some of my students would say, Miss, why did the revolution happen in Haiti, before it happened in Latin America? Well, one of the reasons that the revolution happened in Haiti before Latin America is number one, the geography, the amount of land that Latin America covered. It took much longer for groups in different areas to come together to push out the Spanish in such a vast amount of land. But the case of Saint Domingue is also different because of the percentage of slaves that you had compared to the percentage of whites and free people of color in the are on the island. So it was a very prosperous French colony in the Caribbean. At one point, Saint Domingue produced over 60% of the world's sugar. And I apologize, I didn't mention this before, but for those of us who might not know, Saint Domingue is the name of what present day Haiti is right now. Okay. They also produce coffee, and these plantations depended on slave labor. Now, plantation owners use brutal methods to control the slaves. And starting in 1791, after, we see the French Revolution happening, we see that the slaves started to revolt after the French Revolution started. And so they took advantage of the political turmoil that was going on in France to start their revolts and eventually their revolution. Now, interestingly enough, the slaves made up 90% of the population. And then you have the whites, I believe they made up um, a small percentage, as well as the free people of color. So collectively, the whites and the free people of color made up the rest of the population. right. So we know that the events that were going on in France, they had the French Revolution, and then later on they moved into the reign of terror in France. It divided those French men and women who were here in Saint Domingue, and there is a map of Saint Domingue. So it's that pinkish area and that green area here on the map. The slaves took advantage of the split and took control of the colony, and the rebels were led by Toussaint or Toussaint Louverture, and eventually they would become independent. It was the first Latin American country to win independence, and this definitely had a big impact in Latin America because they saw how they were able to take over and how they were able to win a revolution. It was definitely inspirational. Now let's talk about the impact of the Haitian Revolution. Now, the Haitian Revolution, and again, Haiti is in Latin America. How did it impact us here in the United States? Well, it impacted the abolitionist movement here in the United States. It was definitely an inspiration for the pursuit of liberty, but that doesn't mean that African Americans did not already have a history of rebelling or revolting against the institution of slavery, because there were many well documented cases before the the Haitians became free from the French in 1804 of slaves revolting against their masters. Black newspapers featured stories from the revolution in the Caribbean, and there were a couple of revolts that popped up or that occurred in 1800 and 1801 that were specifically inspired by the revolution. But one of the interesting things is that they also wanted the liberation of all peoples internationally. So as the revolution movement was going on and coming toward its end in Haiti, and yes, it gave the blacks inspiration that liberation could happen. They did understand the unique situation of Haiti, how many slaves there were versus the whites and the free people of color, but they saw that it could be done. And they wanted everyone around the world to be free. That wasn't free at this point in time. I want to point out before we move forward and talk about how Latinos and African Americans have worked together about Thomas Jefferson. And the reason why I want to talk about Thomas Jefferson is because, as we know, he has a lot to do with the founding of the United States. He has a lot to do, with the Declaration of Independence and the idea of slavery and freedom. But he had a very strong response to what was going on in Haiti. And then I also want to talk briefly about Lemuel Haynes, who was an African American man, and his response to Thomas Jefferson, not in this time right at the time of the Haitian Revolution, but at the time that he wrote the Declaration of Independence, because I think it's important for us to get a perspective of someone who is Black and how they feel about what is going on in the United States. So Jefferson was mortified about what happened in Haiti. By 1806, shortly after Haiti became free, we know they became free in 1804, he asked Congress to halt trade with Haiti. He barely even wanted to recognize Haiti as its own independent nation. Now, if we look at what happened during the Haitian Revolution, we understand that many of the factors of production of the plantations were destroyed in Haiti. Not to mention the new Haitian government had to pay reparations to France. And then after all of that, when the United States under Thomas Jefferson, you know, who asked Congress to halt trade, it just hurt the Haitian economy so bad. It decimated the Haitian economy. And Thomas Jefferson was even quoted as saying that this is what happens when Africans are allowed to govern themselves: economic, devastation caused in large by its own economic policies. So he definitely was not for the Haitian people, and he was scared that their ideas would move over to the United States. So, going to the point of Thomas Jefferson when he was a bit younger, I want to talk about Lemuel Haynes. He's not mentioned a lot in history, and I just thought this is a great opportunity to mention him because he comes up with some very interesting points. Now, Lemuel Haynes in 1776 wrote an essay called Liberty Further Extended, or Free Thoughts on the Illegality of Slave Keeping in 1776. Now, he was a man of mixed heritage who fought at the American Revolution, and he was stationed at Fort Ticonderoga. He also had a lot of other accolades in his life. He became a congregational minister in Vermont for 30 years. He was conferred a master's degree in 1804, and he really lived a long life. He even had a book or a biography, a kind of a biographical book, a combination there written about him in the 1830s. But after that point in time, we really don't hear about him. But I read over his essay and I picked out part of what I thought was a beautiful quote when he talks about free thoughts on the illegality of slave keeping, his response to this new Declaration of Independence and the idea that all men are created equal. And here it is. He says, and this is, I just want you to know that this is in the language when that's how they wrote back then. It's not a spelling mistake. This is how he wrote his words in the original document. He says, but I query, so I question, right? Whether liberty is so contracted a principle as to be confined to any nation under heaven. Nay, I think it not hyperbolical to affirm that even an African has equally as good as a right to his liberty in common with Englishmen. So he's saying that liberty is not something that is just for one group of people. It's not so contracted where it's like, okay, only Englishmen, could have freedom. He says it's not confined to just one nation under heaven. Remember, he later becomes a pastor for 30 years. So he's a very religious man. He says, nay, like, no, I don't think it's hard for us to affirm that even an African has equally as good as a right to liberty. So Africans also have a right to liberty. And his words are very powerful. And it's one of the few times that you see in printed form a Black man giving his opinion on slavery as it relates to the founding of our nation. So it's a very unique perspective. And considering that Thomas Jefferson and, tying it back to Haiti, had such a strong response against what was going on in Haiti, the fact that the man who wrote the Declaration of Independence did not want to give or afford these same freedoms or acknowledge that the Haitian people had the same rights to declare freedom, just as, Thomas Jefferson and all those other men did during the American Revolution, is a huge thing. Right. I also wanted to discuss the connection between Simon Bolivar, who is the liberator, and Pétion. And I apologize if I'm not pronouncing his name right. So in December of 1815, of course, this is well after, Haiti becomes independent in 1804. So this is like, 11 years later. Simon Bolivar, he tried once before against the Spanish crown to get rid of the Spanish crown and the empire, but he was exiled. And when he was exiled, guess where he went to? He went to Haiti. He went to OK after being defeated in Cartagena by the Spaniards. So Bolivar, along with his soldiers, was helped by Alexandre Pétion. He was the president of Haiti. He was also a man of mixed heritage, but he provided them with food and shelter. He gave them 4,000 rifles, he gave them gunpowder, and he gave them food. And in exchange, Pétion requested that Bolivar free the slaves once Latin America became independent. Again, this idea of we're all working for one common cause, that we want people to be free, for Black people to be free, and any slaves to be free, was something that, was to the core of Pétion and the people of Haiti. They wanted other people to have that freedom as well. Okay, so let's compare them side by side before we jump into more present day or modern day times in the 20th century, and how Latinos and African Americans work together. So, if we look at Latin Americans, slavery began after conquest for Native Americans, and then we see after a petition by Bartholomew de las Casas to stop enslaving the Indian people in the mid 1500s, we see more and more Africans being bought or brought over here with the triangular trade system. Here in the United States, we see that slavery began in 1619 in Jamestown. We both had plantation systems. In Latin America, we have the social pyramid. Those who are not full European occupy the lower levels of society. African Americans as slaves were not here in the United States, were not citizens. They lacked fundamental rights. Even freedmen were discriminated against. We also look at de jure segregation or oppression. And as I talked before, we looked at how, from the very beginning, the Spanish crown, divided the Spanish with the República de Indios and República de Españoles, the Indian kind of republic and the Spanish republic. Um, and only European born people had access to positions of power. Here in the United States, we have a long history, including the Black Codes that were instituted after the Civil War, Jim Crow, de jure, and de facto segregation. So, de facto segregation is the type of segregation that is not necessarily in the law books, but it just naturally happens. We have poll taxes, grandfather clauses, and the list goes on and on. And then we look at a strong history of social activism, especially in Mexico and in Haiti, and the fact or the idea that everyone should have rights to have access to rights and government. And then here in the United States, we have a long history of rebellion and resistance against the institution of slavery. Now, even though slavery wasn't as institutionalized, and this is my opinion, as it was in Latin America, we can definitely draw some similarities between what is happening in the United States and what is happening or what was happening in Latin America. All right. So now we're going to look at Black and Brown working together. And I'm going to start with a conference that we don't really talk about. And to be honest with you, it's not something that I even learned about until a few months ago. So, Chapultepec is a suburb of Mexico City. Okay. And we know in 1945, World War II ends in May of 1945 in Europe, and then later on in August of 1945 with victory over Japan. As a matter of fact, we just had a huge anniversary for VE Day that just passed. Now, this conference was nicknamed the Chapultepec Conference, but it was really the interwar American Conference on Problems of War and Peace. So, one of the things that we see after World War II is so many changes on the world map. If you look at a map from, say, 1945 to even 1970, you see that there is a lot of nationalist movements, a lot of people who were, colonized no longer want to be a colony. They want to have their own independent countries. So, understanding that there's this kind of destabilization in the world, This interwar American conference was held in Mexico. It included the United States and 20 other European, sorry, not European, um, countries from Latin America. Okay, so the United States and 20 nations from, North America, Latin America, and the Caribbean. So their goal, or the goal of the conference, was to maintain peace and security. We also understand that the US delegation wanted to focus on trade and security. Now, here's what's interesting. We just talked about how really Haiti led the way in Latin America by breaking the horrible cycle of slavery in Saint Domingue, forming their own country, having their own government, even though they were off to a very rough start due to many different reasons. And here, the Haitians are again taking a stand and understanding that the United States has not only repeatedly intervened in their country, but also places like Nicaragua and the Dominican Republic and in Mexico. And they decided to say, or to do the following. They decided to submit a resolution. The reason why this resolution is important is because it sets the tone for how we all view each other in a common cause. So the resolution said that the security of the hemisphere hinged on the equality of nations, as well as the equality of peoples in those nations. So it was a huge declaration, and it really called out the racial discrimination of minority groups. And while it was not as strongly worded when this Treaty of Chapultepec was finally signed, it was a clear indicator that it was time that people be viewed on equal footing, regardless of the race of that person or the minority groups. Because let's be real, if we look at North America, right? And we look at Latin America, there are more people of color than there are whites. And the way that the United States had acted with their foreign policy measures, which is well documented, the people were not treated fairly. Now, another thing that's interesting is that it was not covered widely here in the United States. And that's one of the reasons why I believe that it's not in many of our history books. But a lot of people took what happened at the Chapultepec Conference, including African Americans. They were following you know, this conference, and they were very excited about the wording that was coming out of it. And we also know that this is a time where African American soldiers are coming back from the war. They have the Double V campaign, right? Double V standing for victory against Hitler and victory against discrimination and racism at home. Not to mention, we also have Latin Americans and other minority groups who fought in World War II and who are coming back with a renewed sense of fighting against discrimination in the United States. Okay, and so that's the Chapultepec Conference. The next thing that I wanted to talk about is the case of Méndez versus Westminster. This case is the precursor to Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. So this is one of the beginning examples of how we see Latinos and African Americans coming together and, for social causes. So what's interesting about this case is not only do we have African American organizations, we have Latinos and Latino organizations, and Jewish organizations that work together in this case. So the case is started when in Orange County, California, Mexican parents challenged the school district because their children were segregated and receiving an inferior education. That is a photograph of Sylvia Méndez. She was supposed to go to a school that was 1 mile away from her house, but she was not allowed to go to the school, she was told, because she was Mexican. And at that time, the Mexican kids were sent to another school that wasn't as good as that school that was really close to her home. So her parents, on her behalf, and other Mexican parents filed a lawsuit. And the Jewish American Congress, later on, after this was moved up the court system, they filed a brief on behalf of the parents from this school district in the Orange County, California. And the counsel on the case included Polly Murray and Thurgood Marshall, who is pictured on the right there, in front of the Supreme Court. Now, the thing is that the NAACP had actually been working um, in the 1930s and the 1940s to support court cases. And we know, of course, in 1954, with the passing of Brown versus Board, that they had a huge win. So this was one of the court cases that they worked together to sponsor, and it would give a stronger footing and hopefully set a precedent nationally to move the country in the direction of desegregation and to move away from this idea that, um, separate is, or to move to the idea that separate is not equal. So both documents, in their opening, required the nations that, I'm sorry, let me move back a little bit. The both documents cited the Treaty of Chapultepec and the UN Charter. They believe that both documents required the nations that signed it to outlaw discrimination and its causes. We're then going to move on to coups, military interventions, and dirty wars. So, African Americans continue to speak out against U.S. actions in Latin America. In 1954, during the Red Scare, the United States declared communists were trying to take over Guatemala, and the U.S. government overthrew the leader Jacobo Arbenz, who attempted to break up the plantation style system set up by the United Fruit Company, which was heavily invested by the United States. And so we see in newspapers, in African American newspapers, protests against what was happening, in Latin America, in particular in Guatemala. We also see that farm workers began to organize. We know in 1965, there was a national boycott of tabletop grapes by the United Farm Workers Union. Now, we know that Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, and an organization of Filipino workers came together to form the United Farm Workers Union. And one of the things that they wanted to do was to make sure that the Delano growers of grapes were hurt financially, by stopping American people from buying table grapes, something as simple as table grapes. But that wouldn't happen without a tremendous amount of support from students and from different organizations. So, what I found interesting is that SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality, played a very important role in educating consumers, in the South, when it came to the importance of them not buying those table grapes and how it impacted and the farm workers and how the farm workers were treated. So after a few years, by 1970, the farm workers were able to gain many rights, better working conditions, and higher pay. Another interesting thing that I wanted to mention is that Dolores Huerta, when she's talking about the farm workers, she notes that the farm workers weren't only Mexican, but they were also Filipino, they were Negro, and they were Puerto Rican. So it's so many people that are being impacted by the work that the farm workers, the United Farm Workers Union, was doing. Right. The next thing that we are going to look at are rainbow coalitions. These coalitions are multicultural, multi-ethnic coalitions that came together to fight under one cause that have a common purpose. So in 1969, the Black Panther Party created the original Labor Coalition or Rainbow Coalition. It included the Young Lords, who were Puerto Rican, and the Young Patriots, who were a white activist group. And one of the things that Carlton Yearwood said from the Black Panthers said about the Rainbow Coalition is that we believe that racism comes out of a class struggle. So this is where we see solidarity. So organizers consciously adopted what historian Jacoby Williams calls a universal identity of politics. And this is important to understand because we see again that we should be fighting together in solidarity under a common cause. Along with the rainbow coalitions, we see both Latinos and Blacks coming together with the anti-apartheid movement. So starting in the 1960s, we have multiracial organizations that joined together against apartheid. The founder of the United Construction Workers out of Seattle, Tyree Scott, traveled to Mozambique and South Africa in the 1970s. Now, Tyree Scott challenged how Seattle was dealing with Black construction workers and wanted them to have more jobs and just a shot at getting more jobs and doing better within that area. But I think it's so interesting that he took his work and saw what was happening in Seattle, but saw that what was happening there had a connection to what was happening in Mozambique and also what was happening in South Africa. So he traveled to both of those locations in the 1970s. In 1985, Latinos for Free South Africa was founded by Howard Jordan, Jose Rivera, who's a New York City councilman, and Roberto Garcia, who was a congressman, a Hispanic congressman. And what they did is that they lobbied and used international diplomacy against apartheid. And one of the things that I want to mention is that, and I believe it was Tyree who said this, is that the question of Black and the question of whether it's Black or whether it's Chicano, or the fact that we have Chicano versus Black is just, it's BS. The only way you're going to get caught up in that question is not knowing who your enemy is. So a lot of times the narrative is put out there that it's, oh, it's just for Chicano people, or, Latino people, or, this is just for Black people, or they're against each other. But really, if you look at it and you kind of flip it and see that the groups are fighting against um, the same thing, then you see that you open up your minds a little bit more. And I misspoke. That quote didn't come from Tyree. So um, I hope that throughout this presentation that you see that Latinos, with their strong social activism, and African Americans, especially after the Second World War, that you see that based on their history, based on commonalities, that they were able to see themselves in a different way, to understand that there are many worldwide and class struggles as they relate to race, and to poor people and that if they work together, they could move forward. Now, I'm not saying that the world is perfect or that we have the most perfect relations between, Latinos and African Americans, but I am going to argue that if we look more and we dig further into history, that we will see that coming together and fighting for social causes and social activism will only benefit both groups. And this is the end of the presentation. I hope that today you have learned something about social activism and the commonalities that we share between African Americans and Latinos. And I wish you all well.